She was going through her wallet for the third time, hands trembling. Not because she was afraid, because she already knew what wasn't there. $22, heart medication sitting on the counter 3 feet away, already filled, already paid for by a system that had just decided she didn't qualify. The pharmacist looked at her the way people look at things they've already decided don't matter. She gave a small nod, the kind that means I understand. I'm sorry for taking up your time. And she started to walk away. That nod broke something open in me that has never fully closed. My name is Michael Rourke. I've been a Hell's Angel for 44 years. And what happened the next morning on Mariposa Street is something nobody in that neighborhood, nobody in that pharmacy will ever forget. I've been carrying things my whole life. Not just the usual weight a man accumulates. The regrets, the losses, the faces of people you wronged and never got the chance to make it right. I mean the physical kind too. The weight of a 74 shovel head between your legs on a highway that never seemed to end. The weight of a leather vest that's been patched and repatched so many times, it's more memory than fabric. The weight of 72 years lived mostly outside the lines that polite society drew around itself. My name is Michael Rourke, and I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning in October that changed something in me. Something I didn't even know still had the capacity to change. Bakersfield, California. If you've never been, picture a city that smells like oil refineries and almond blossoms fighting each other for dominance, where the Central Valley heat presses down on you like a hand on the back of your neck from June through September, and where by October you finally get a breath of something that almost feels like mercy. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter, low clouds moving in from the west, the kind of morning that makes your joints ache and your coffee tastes better than usual. I was 68 years old when this happened. I want to be clear about that because the man telling this story now, 72, slower, with 2 replaced knees and a heart that skips like a scratched record sometimes, is not quite the same man who walked into that pharmacy on Oak Street, but close enough that when I close my eyes, I can still smell the antiseptic and floor wax of that place. Still hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, like they were trying to say something nobody wanted to hear. I'd been a member of the Hells Angels for going on 40 years at that point. Joined when I was 28, which made me a late bloomer by some measures. Most of the guys I rode with had patches before they were 25, but I had a detour. 2 years in the Army, a failed marriage to a woman named Sandra who deserved better than what I gave her, and a period in my late 20s where I was drifting between construction jobs in the San Joaquin Valley, sleeping in my truck more often than not, trying to figure out what kind of man I was going to be. The club found me, or maybe I found it. Either way, it fit. Not because of the reputation, the mythology that Hollywood and the newspapers had built up around the name, not because of the danger or the romance of it. It fit because for the first time in my life, I was around men who said what they meant and meant what they said. Men who showed up. Men who, if you were their brother, would drive through the night to stand next to you without asking why. I know what people think when they hear Hells Angels. I've watched it my whole life. The way a grocery store would go quiet when a group of us walked in. The way mothers would pull their children a little closer. The way cops would find reasons to run our plates. I'm not going to stand here and tell you every piece of that reputation was unearned. We weren't a church choir. There were men in our ranks over the decades who did things I'm not proud to have been associated with. The world of outlaw motorcycle clubs is not a world of clean hands. But I'll tell you this, and I mean it with everything I've got left in me at 72. The men I rode with in that Bakersfield chapter were some of the most loyal, most principled human beings I ever knew. Their principles weren't always the same as the ones they taught you in Sunday school, but they were principles, and chief among them was this: you do not mess with people who can't defend themselves. You do not use your size, your position, your power to grind down someone who's already got nothing left to lose. That's not just a rule we had, it was a religion. So, October, Tuesday morning. I'd been up since 5, which is standard for me now, and was standard for me then. Sleep and I have had a complicated relationship since Vietnam. I did one tour, came back mostly whole on the outside, and spent the better part of a decade learning that the inside was a different story. By my late 30s, I'd made a kind of peace with it. You learn to live with the early mornings and the dreams that aren't quite nightmares, but aren't quite anything else either. I'd had my coffee. I'd done my 40 minutes on the stationary bike that my doctor had practically begged me to buy after my first knee replacement. I'd fed the 2 dogs, a shepherd mix named Carver and a fat old beagle named Slim, who had been with me for 11 years and moved like he was carrying the weight of all those years in every step. I checked in with Hank by text, Hank Bosley, my closest brother in the club for going on 30 years, a big barrel-chested man from Fresno who had a laugh like a truck backfiring and hands that could crush walnuts bare. He'd texted back a single word, which was typical: good. That was Hank's entire emotional vocabulary when things were fine. When things weren't fine, you got a phone call. I needed to pick up a prescription. Nothing dramatic, blood pressure medication, the kind that costs nothing if you got insurance and costs a small fortune if you don't. I had insurance, had it for years through the club's arrangement with a provider. I pulled on my jeans, my boots, my flannel shirt. I didn't put on the vest. Some days I did, some days I didn't. That morning I didn't feel like the conversation it invited. When you're 68 years old and you just want to pick up a prescription and get back to your coffee, you don't always want to be a symbol. I drove the truck. My bike was in the garage, a 2009 Road King that I'd spent 2 summers customizing and that I treated better than I treated most things in my life. But the truck was practical, and that morning I was feeling practical. Oak Street Pharmacy was 6 blocks from my house. It had been there for at least 20 years. One of those independent pharmacies that somehow survived the CVS and Walgreens invasion by being in exactly the right neighborhood and having a pharmacist who knew his regulars by name. Or so I'd thought. I parked the truck, walked in. The bell above the door made its little sound. The place was not crowded. A Tuesday morning, mid-October, maybe 8 or 9 customers scattered between the aisles of vitamins and greeting cards and the pharmacy counter in the back. Fluorescent lights, as I said, that particular hum. I got in line behind 2 people. Standard procedure. I was looking at my phone, checking the weather, not paying particular attention to anything when I heard the voice. It was the kind of voice that carries without trying to carry. Sharp, efficient, with a particular quality of contempt that I recognized immediately because I'd heard it my whole life, directed at me and the people I rode with. The voice of someone who had decided before the conversation began that the person in front of them was beneath them. I looked up. At the counter stood a woman who I would later learn was named Dorothy Callahan, 78 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall on a good day, white hair pulled back neatly, a blue cardigan that had been washed so many times It had gone soft as cloud. She was holding her purse with both hands in front of her, the way women of her generation sometimes do when they're nervous, like the purse is an anchor, something solid to hold on to when the world gets uncertain. And behind the counter stood Craig Whitfield. Craig Whitfield was 44 years old. I'm giving you his age because it matters. He was a grown man, not some kid who didn't know better. He had the kind of face that must have been reasonably handsome once, but had soured with years of small disappointments and a personality that found comfort in petty authority. He wore a white pharmacist coat that was pressed and clean, a name tag, rimless glasses. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had found a small kingdom and ruled it with disproportionate seriousness. Dorothy was saying something quietly. I couldn't hear her words, but I could hear the shape of them, apologetic, soft, trying to make herself small enough not to cause trouble. I know that shape. I've seen it on people my whole life. People who've been told in 100 small ways that they take up too much space, ask for too much, exist too loudly. Whitfield's response was not quiet. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out like a door closing. "I've already explained this twice. If you don't have the copay, I can't release the medication. That's not a policy I invented. That's how it works." Dorothy said something else, still quiet. Her hands tightened on the purse. "I understand your situation is difficult," Whitfield said, in the tone of a man who understood nothing of the sort. "But I have other customers waiting. Perhaps you should look into assistance programs. There are resources available for people in your—" He paused, and the pause was its own sentence. Situation. I had stopped looking at my phone. The woman in line in front of me shifted uncomfortably, but kept her eyes forward. The other customers in the store had gone to that particular stillness that people adopt when they want to pretend they're not witnessing something they're absolutely witnessing. Dorothy reached into her purse. She took out her wallet, old worn leather, the kind that's been used every day for years, and began going through it again, looking for something that wasn't there. Her hands had a slight tremor, not dramatic, not the shaking you see in illness, just the fine tremor of age, the tremor of hands that have worked for decades and are now past the point where they steady themselves the way they once did. "It's not there," Whitfield said, and now there was something in his voice that went past impatience into something uglier. "Going through your wallet a third time isn't going to change what's in it." The woman in front of me in line made a small sound. I didn't know if it was a gasp or just a breath. I was no longer tracking her at all. I was watching Dorothy. She had stopped going through her wallet. She stood very still. And then she did the thing that cracked something open inside my chest and has not fully closed since. She nodded. A small, slow nod, the kind that means I understand. "I'm sorry for taking up your time. I know I don't matter enough for this to go differently." She put her wallet back in her purse. She picked up her prescription bag. They'd already filled it. It was right there on the counter. And she started to put it back down, to leave it, to walk away without the medication that she had come there for. Heart medication. I found out later. She had come for her heart medication. I was already moving. I don't know exactly what I looked like walking to that counter. I wasn't wearing the vest, as I said, but I'm a big man, or I was then, 6 feet and 2 inches, 230 pounds, with the shoulders of someone who's been lifting and working and riding for 50 years. My arms have been tattooed from wrist to shoulder since my 30s. My hair was silver gray and long, pulled back. My beard, also silver, was the full beard I'd kept for 20 years. I have been told that I have a face that, when it is not actively working at being pleasant, communicates something that people find unsettling. I was not actively working at being pleasant. I walked to the counter and stood next to Dorothy. She looked up at me, startled, the way small animals startle at sudden proximity. I made sure my voice, when I spoke, was level, measured, not loud. There is a kind of authority that comes from not needing to raise your voice, and I'd learned it over decades. "How much is the copay?" I asked Whitfield. Whitfield looked at me. I watched him process what he was looking at. I watched the calculation happen behind his glasses. The tattoos, the size, the face, the hair, the beard. I watched him decide that whatever category he'd put me in, it required a different approach than the one he'd been using with Dorothy. "Sir," he said, careful now, "this isn't—" "I didn't ask for commentary," I said. "I asked how much the copay is." A pause. $22. I took out my wallet. I took out $25 and put it on the counter. "Give her the medication," I said. Whitfield looked at the money, looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not shame, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The discomfort of a man who has been caught doing something he can't quite defend. He processed the payment. He handed Dorothy her medication. Dorothy stood there for a moment, holding the paper bag. Then she turned to me. Her eyes were brown and very clear and very full, and she said, quietly, because quiet was apparently her register for everything, "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. She nodded again, but this time it was a different nod. Not the resignation nod. Something else. Something that looked like a person being seen. She left. I picked up my own prescription. I did not say anything else to Whitfield. I didn't need to. I walked out of the pharmacy and sat in my truck for a long moment in the gray October morning, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in a while. Something that was partly anger, clean anger, the kind that comes from witnessing something genuinely wrong, and partly something older, something that lived deeper in me than anger. I'd seen a lot of injustice in my life. You don't ride for 40 years without seeing what the world does to people when it thinks nobody's watching. You don't grow up the way I grew up, working class, fatherless by 14, in and out of trouble before I found the Army, and then the road, without developing a particular sensitivity to the way power works, to the small and large ways that people with a little of it use it against people with none. But there was something about that moment, the blue cardigan, the worn wallet, the slow, dignified nod of a woman deciding not to fight because she'd learned there was no point. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes. Then I texted Hank, "Need to talk tonight, chapter business." His reply came in 40 seconds. "My place or the clubhouse?" "Clubhouse," I wrote back. "And tell Travis." Travis Webb was our chapter president, 55 years old, a former Marine from Victorville who ran the Bakersfield chapter like a man who'd thought carefully about what a chapter should be. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't theatrical, but he had a moral compass that I'd trusted for 15 years. And if I was going to do what I was already beginning to think I was going to do, I needed him on board. I drove home. I let the dogs out. I made another pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down what I'd seen in as much detail as I could remember. The words Whitfield had used, the look on Dorothy's face, the way the other customers had looked away. I wrote it all down because I've learned that memory is unreliable, and that when you're going to take action, real action, action that matters, You need to be sure you're acting on what actually happened and not on the version of it that your emotions have improved. What I'd written down was plenty. That evening, I drove to the clubhouse. It's not a dramatic building, a converted warehouse on the south side of Bakersfield, with a parking lot big enough for 40 bikes and a common room that smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke and a particular smell of a place where men have gathered honestly for a long time. There were photographs on the walls going back to the 60s, men who were dead now, men who were old like me, men whose stories were threaded through everything we were. Hank was already there when I arrived, a beer in his hand, sitting at the long table that served as our meeting spot for anything that wasn't an official chapel session. Travis came in 10 minutes after me, wearing a flannel and jeans like always, his Marine Corps tattoo visible below his rolled sleeve. "Talk to me," Travis said. I talked to him. I told them about Dorothy, about Whitfield, about the $22 copay and the heart medication, and the nod that she gave when she decided to leave without it. I told it straight, the way I'd written it down, without embellishment. When I finished, there was a silence. Hank was looking at his beer. Travis was looking at me. "You want to do something about it," Travis said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know if she's all right," I said. "I want to know if she has what she needs. And then I want to think about what else ought to happen." Travis nodded slowly. "You know her name?" "No, but I know what she looks like. And Peggy Stanton lives 2 blocks from Oak Street. She knows everybody in that neighborhood." Peggy Stanton was a woman in her early 70s who had grown up in that part of Bakersfield and still lived in the house she'd been born in. She wasn't in the club, wasn't connected to it in any formal way, but she'd known Hank for 30 years through his sister and had a network of neighborhood knowledge that was its own kind of infrastructure. If anyone knew an elderly woman in a blue cardigan who shopped at Oak Street Pharmacy, it was Peggy. "Call her tonight," Travis said. "Find out what you can. We'll talk more tomorrow." I called Peggy from the parking lot of the clubhouse, standing next to my truck in the dark with the Central Valley stars overhead, the distant sound of freight trains on the tracks 2 miles west. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I described what I'd seen, and she went quiet for a moment and said, "Michael, that's Dorothy Callahan. She lives on Mariposa, has for 40 years. Her husband Walter passed 3 years ago. Her son moved to Phoenix and calls maybe twice a year." Something settled in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. "Is she all right?" I asked. "She gets by," Peggy said. "Social Security and what Walter left her, which wasn't much. She has heart problems. Been managing them for years. She's a proud woman, Michael. Raised 3 kids, kept that house up, volunteered at the library for 15 years. She doesn't ask for anything." "No," I said, "she doesn't." After I hung up, I stood in that parking lot for a while longer. The freight train went by in the distance, its horn long and low in the dark. I thought about my mother, who had died at 81 in a similar house in a similar neighborhood in Stockton, who had also not asked for anything because she'd learned that asking didn't usually get you anywhere. I thought about all the Dorothys in all the towns along all the roads I'd ever ridden, living quietly in houses that needed work, getting by on what they had, being invisible to the people whose job it was to help them. I went home. I didn't sleep much. By 4 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table again, with the legal pad, and by 5 I had a plan. I want to explain something about the way things work in a chapter, because I think people on the outside have a picture of it that's either too romantic or too sinister, and the truth is more ordinary and more meaningful than either. A chapter is, at its core, a group of men who have made a commitment to each other. Not a vague, sentimental commitment, a real one, with teeth in it. When something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. When one of us sees something wrong, and it's within our power to address it, addressing it isn't a favor or an act of charity. It's an obligation. That's not a PR statement. That's not me trying to rehabilitate an image. That's just what it is. And it's been what it is for as long as I've been a member. And it's why, when I came back to the clubhouse the next morning with my legal pad and my plan, I didn't have to persuade anyone. Travis was there. Hank was there. 8 other members were there. Men ranging in age from their 30s to their mid-60s. Men with jobs and families and histories and the particular worn-in quality that comes from having lived fully and not always cleanly. I told them everything again. The pharmacy, Dorothy, Whitfield, what Peggy had told me. I told them what I thought we should do. The room was quiet when I finished. Then Gary Briggs, who was 53 and had been with the chapter for 20 years and was not a man given to sentiment, said, "What do we need from each of us?" That was the whole conversation. Well, not quite. There were logistics. There always are. And that's the part that nobody in the movie shows you. The unglamorous practical work of actually doing something instead of just feeling strongly about it. Travis made a call to a contact he had at a pharmaceutical supplier he knew through legitimate channels. The chapter had been involved in charity work for years, runs for children's hospitals and veterans groups, and Travis had built a network of people in the community who trusted us because we'd given them reason to. Through that contact, we could get Dorothy's medication and refills covered for the next year. Hank got on the phone with brothers from the Fresno chapter, then Visalia, then Stockton, then Sacramento. I made calls to chapters in Los Angeles and San Diego. Travis reached out to contacts in Nevada and Arizona. This is the thing about the network. When it moves, it moves. And when it moves for a reason that everyone understands to be right, it moves fast. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I know how it sounds. I know the narrative that could be constructed out of what we were doing. 300 motorcycle club members descending on the home of an elderly woman. That sounds, on its surface, like something out of a movie that ends badly. I understand why people who don't know us, who have only the mythology to go on, might hear 300 Hell's Angels and picture something threatening. But here's what we were actually doing. We were making sure that a woman who had been humiliated and dismissed was seen, truly seen, not by one man who happened to be in the right place, by a community. We were making sure she knew that what had happened to her was wrong, and that wrong things do not go unwitnessed, and that she mattered enough for a few hundred people to rearrange their Tuesday morning to say so. We were also, and I won't pretend otherwise, making a point to Craig Whitfield and everyone like him. Not a violent point, not a threatening point, a clear point. How you treat the vulnerable is not a private act. The world is watching. Some parts of the world you wouldn't expect are watching very closely. The afternoon before we went to Dorothy's, I drove by Oak Street Pharmacy, not to go inside, just to drive by. Whitfield was behind the counter. I could see him through the window, the pressed white coat, the glasses, the small posture of a man in his small kingdom. He didn't see me. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to remind myself of what I'd witnessed, to make sure that the fire I'd been carrying since Tuesday morning was still burning clean, not hot and dirty and aimed wrong. There's a difference between justice and revenge, and it's a difference I'd had to learn the hard way more than once in my life. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Justice is about making something right. What I'd seen in that pharmacy had nothing to do with me. Dorothy Callahan had never met me. Her dignity was not connected to mine. Her suffering was not my suffering. I had no personal stake in this, beyond the fact that I was a human being who had witnessed another human being being ground down for the crime of being old and poor and unable to fight back. That's enough. That has always been enough. I drove home. I polished the Road King because I always think more clearly when my hands have something to do. Carver sat in the garage doorway watching me the way he always did, with the patient attention of a dog who has decided his job is to accompany rather than to interrupt. Slim was already asleep on his bed inside, which was Slim's response to most things. Hank called at 9 that evening. "We've got commitments from 280 brothers," he said. "Travis thinks we'll clear 300 by morning." I set down the polishing cloth. 300. 300 men from across California and Nevada and Arizona, riding to Bakersfield on a Wednesday morning to stand in front of an old woman's house on Mariposa Street. "Who's handling the press?" I asked. "Travis has it," Hank said. "He's already been contacted by 2 local TV stations." Somebody talked. "He's going to make a statement. Keep it clean. Keep it focused on Dorothy and what happened." "Good," I said. "Michael?" Hank's voice shifted, became the voice he used when he was saying something he'd been thinking about for a while. "You know this is bigger than Dorothy." "I know. You know what this says, what we're saying. That's why we're doing it." A pause. Then that truck backfiring laugh of his, low and warm. "Yeah," he said, "that's why. I didn't sleep much that night either. But it wasn't the bad kind of not sleeping. It was the kind where you lie in the dark and feel the size of something, feel the shape of it, and you're not afraid of it. You're just aware. The way you're aware of a long open road before you've started riding it. There was one more thing I needed to do before morning. Something I'd been turning over in my mind since Tuesday. Something that lived on the personal side of this rather than the collective side. I needed to talk to Dorothy. I called Peggy at 10 that evening and asked if she could arrange it. Peggy, who was both discreet and practical, said she'd call Dorothy right then and call me back. 15 minutes later, she did. "She'll see you," Peggy said, "tonight if you want. She's awake. She says she doesn't sleep well anyway." I drove to Mariposa Street at 10:30. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of October quiet that settles in when the heat has finally broken and the nights have gotten cool enough to keep windows closed. The houses were modest, well kept, the kind of street where people have lived for decades and know each other's cars. Dorothy's house had a light on in the front room. I parked and walked up the path and knocked. She opened the door in a house coat and slippers, her white hair down around her shoulders, looking smaller than she had in the pharmacy, but somehow also more substantial, like she was more herself here in her own space than she could ever be in a public place where strangers held power over her. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "You're the man from the pharmacy." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "My name is Michael Rourke." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, Mr. Rourke." I'll put on coffee. Her house was the kind of house that tells you everything about the person who lives in it. Not because it was decorated for show. There was nothing for show in Dorothy Callahan's home. It was clean and simple and full of things that had been used and kept because they mattered. A sofa with cushions worn flat in the middle from years of sitting. Photographs on every surface. A man I assumed was Walter, younger and older versions of him. Children and grandchildren in the stiff posed smiles of school pictures. A woman who might have been Dorothy's mother or sister standing in front of a car that dated the photo to the late 50s. Bookshelves along one wall, full of paperbacks and hardcovers with cracked spines. A small television. A wooden cross above the doorway to the kitchen, simple, unpainted. She made coffee in a percolator, the old kind, and brought it to the living room in mugs that had probably been wedding gifts 40 years ago. She sat across from me in an armchair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with clear, calm eyes. I imagine, she said, that you didn't just come to check on me. I almost smiled. Sharp woman. No, I said, I wanted to make sure you were all right. And I wanted to tell you that some things are going to happen tomorrow that you should know about beforehand. She listened while I told her. I told her about the chapter, about the calls that had been made, about the 300 men who would be arriving at Mariposa Street in the morning. I told her about the medication arrangement, that her heart medication and her refills were covered for the next year through a fund that had been established for exactly this kind of situation. I told her about Travis's plan to speak to the press. She didn't interrupt. She held her coffee mug in both hands and listened the way a person listens when they've learned to wait for the whole story before responding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Why, she said finally, not suspicious, genuinely asking, genuinely curious about what had led a man like me to her door at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. I thought about the answer for a moment before I gave it. I wanted to give her the true one, not the convenient one. Because what happened to you was wrong, I said, and because I've spent a lot of my life in situations where people like me were the ones being looked at wrong, being dismissed, being treated like we weren't worth the basic courtesy that everybody's supposed to deserve. I paused. And because I've spent a lot of my life not always being the good guy in the story. And there are times when you get a chance to be something different, and you take it. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, which I wouldn't have wanted, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understood, in their own way, what it meant to be measured by someone else's idea of your worth and found wanting. Walter would have liked you, she said. Tell me about Walter. So she did. For the next hour in that quiet house on Mariposa Street, with the October night outside the windows and the old percolator keeping the coffee warm, Dorothy Callahan told me about Walter, who had worked for the railroad for 32 years and coached Little League on weekends and could fix anything mechanical that you put in front of him. She told me about raising 3 children in this house, about the years when money was tight and they made it work anyway, about the garden Walter kept in the backyard that she still tended herself, badly, because she couldn't bear to let it go entirely. She told me about her heart condition, mitral valve something or other, I'm not a medical man, that had been diagnosed 6 years ago, and that she managed with medication and a modified diet and the particular pragmatism of a woman who had learned that bodies, like everything else, required maintenance and eventually wore out. She told me about Roy, her son in Phoenix, who called twice a year and sent money at Christmas and had his own life and his own problems, and loved her in the way that people love the things they've moved away from, genuinely, but at a manageable distance. He means well, she said about Roy, without bitterness, just as a fact. I know the type, I said. When I stood to leave, she stood too and walked me to the door. At the door she stopped and looked up at me with those clear brown eyes and said, "Mr. Rourke, I've seen your kind before. I mean," she gestured, "at my tattoos, my general appearance, men like you. My experience has not always been positive." "I understand," I said. "But I also know," she said, "that people are not only what they look like. Walter taught me that. He was a large, frightening-looking man, too, you know. People who didn't know him were afraid of him." She almost smiled. "He was the gentlest person I ever met." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "I'll be on my porch tomorrow morning," she said. "What time should I expect you?" 8 o'clock, I said, give or take. She nodded. "I'll make coffee," she said. "There will be enough for everyone." I laughed at that. A real laugh, which is not something that came easily to me by then. "Mrs. Callahan," I said, "there are going to be 300 of us." She tilted her head slightly. "Then I'll make a lot of coffee," she said. The morning came in cool and clear. The overnight clouds burned off by a thin October sun that lit up the Central Valley in that particular golden way it has in autumn. I was at the clubhouse at 6. Bikes were already arriving. From Fresno, from Visalia, from Los Angeles, long lines of headlights on the highway. The sound of engines building from a rumble to a roar as the parking lot filled. Travis was at the center of it all, the way Travis always was. Calm, efficient, talking to brothers from other chapters, coordinating without making it look like coordination. He had spoken to the 2 local TV stations the night before and given them the outline of what we were doing and why, and both of them had agreed to cover it with a framing that focused on Dorothy rather than on us. Travis was good at that, at understanding that the story was not about us, and making sure it stayed that way. Hank found me in the crowd and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "How's she doing?" he asked. He'd heard about my visit the night before. "She's making coffee for 300 people, I said. Hank stared at me, then that laugh again, big and uncontainable. "Lord," he said, "I love this woman already." By 7:30, there were 312 motorcycles lined up along the road outside the clubhouse. Men from 8 different chapters, ranging in age from their mid-20s to one brother named Old Pete, who was 79 years old and had been riding since Eisenhower was president. The sound of that many engines when they started was not a sound. It was a physical event. It went through you, replaced the air in your lungs with something that vibrated. We rode through Bakersfield in a column that stretched for half a mile. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and people were going to work, dropping kids at school, getting coffee. Some of them pulled over and stopped. Some of them took out their phones. All of them looked. I was near the front of the column, behind Travis, with Hank to my right. The Road King was running perfectly, as it always did when I'd spent time on it. The air was clean, and the sky was clear, and I want to be exact about this, I felt the way I imagine people feel in church when the music is right and the words are true, and something bigger than themselves is moving through the room. We turned onto Mariposa Street. Dorothy was on her porch. She was wearing the blue cardigan again, over a white blouse, with slacks and her good shoes. Her white hair was up. She was standing straight, her hands clasped in front of her, watching us come. And as the first bikes turned onto her street, and she saw the column stretching back and back and back, I watched something happen to her face. Not fear, not overwhelm. Something that was the opposite of the expression she'd worn in the pharmacy. The anti-resignation, the anti-invisibility. Something that said, I see you seeing me. I understand what this means. Travis cut his engine at the head of the column. One by one, engine by engine, the street went quiet. 312 men on 312 motorcycles on a quiet street in Bakersfield, California, in the October morning light. The silence was enormous. Travis walked up the path to Dorothy's porch. He stood there, this former Marine from Victorville, and he said simply, Mrs. Callahan, we're here because what happened to you was wrong, and because you deserve to know that people are paying attention. That's all. Dorothy nodded, that particular nod of hers, but different, entirely different from the one in the pharmacy. This one was not resignation. This one was receipt, the nod of a woman accepting something that was owed. Thank you, she said, the same words she'd said to me in the pharmacy, but carrying an entirely different weight. All of you, thank you. Then she looked out at 300 men on 300 bikes in her street, and she said, in that same quiet voice that carried somehow to everyone, I made coffee. It's inside. Please come in, as many as you can fit. The rest of you, I'll bring it out. Oh, Pete, from somewhere in the back of the column, started laughing, and then everyone was laughing. The way people laugh when something is both absurd and exactly right at the same time. And the laughter went up the street like the engines had, like something with its own momentum, its own life. I want to tell you about the part they didn't film. The cameras from the 2 local stations were there, and they filmed Travis's statement and Dorothy on her porch and the column of bikes, and the story ran that evening and then got picked up by a wire service and then went, as things do now, everywhere. I watched some of it later on the laptop that my niece had set up for me, and it was fine. It was accurate. It was fair. It focused on Dorothy the way Travis had intended. There was a segment about Craig Whitfield, handled delicately, that resulted in the pharmacy's ownership conducting what they publicly called a review of customer service practices, and what privately I understood through Peggy's network resulted in Whitfield receiving something between a serious reprimand and a demotion. I don't know the details, and I don't need to. That part of it was never what this was about. What they didn't film was the inside of Dorothy's house. 40 men crowded into that small living room with their coffee mugs, sitting on every available surface, and Dorothy moving among them in her blue cardigan, refilling cups, asking names, asking where people were from, listening with genuine interest to the answers. Old Pete sat on the sofa and told her about his wife who had passed the previous spring, and Dorothy sat next to him and listened the way she must have listened to everyone in her life, completely, without distraction, with the full weight of her attention on the person in front of her. I watched old Pete's face change while she listened. I watched the grief loosen a little, the way grief sometimes does when you give it room. Hank was in the kitchen, having appointed himself to manage the coffee situation, which he did with the same focused energy he brought to everything. There is a particular kind of man, and Hank was one of them, for whom caring for people is expressed entirely through practical action, through the making of coffee and the fixing of things, and the showing up when showing up is what's needed. Dorothy understood this about him immediately. I watched them work together in that small kitchen with the ease of people who have known each other for years. I stayed on the porch for most of it, watching the street. Brothers were sitting on their bikes, talking, drinking coffee from paper cups that Peggy Stanton had apparently materialized from somewhere. I found out later she'd gone to the grocery store at 6 in the morning and bought everything they had. Some of them were talking to neighbors who had come out to see what was happening, and the conversations were ordinary and human in the way that conversations always are when the mythology falls away and there are just people talking to other people. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, came down the sidewalk holding her mother's hand and stopped to look at the bikes. One of the brothers, a young guy from the LA chapter, early 30s, covered in tattoos like a wall covered in murals, squatted down to her level and asked if she wanted to see the engine. The mother hesitated for exactly 1 second and then relaxed, because whatever she'd expected when she'd walked out of her house that morning into a street full of Hell's Angels, this was not it. The little girl said yes. He showed her. I have thought about that image many times in the 4 years since it happened. A tattooed man in a leather vest showing a 6-year-old girl how a motorcycle engine works on a quiet street in October, while an old woman served coffee inside. I've thought about it because it contains, for me, more truth about who we were, who we are, than anything I could construct with words. The gap between the idea of us and the reality of us, present in a single morning on a single street. Around 11 o'clock, the brothers began leaving in ones and twos and small groups, the engine starting up again, the column reassembling in the other direction. Travis came to find me on the porch. "Good thing," he said. "Just that." "Yeah," I said. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment. Then he went to his bike. Hank was the last to leave, because of course he was. He came out of the kitchen, having washed every coffee mug and put them away and wiped down the counter, which I only found out about because Dorothy told me later, laughing softly. He stood on the porch and looked at me and said, "Your mother would be proud of you today." I didn't say anything, couldn't quite. He went to his bike. He rode away. I was alone on the porch. The street was quiet again, the way streets return to themselves after something extraordinary has moved through them. The same, but carrying the memory of difference. The October sun was higher now, the golden light of morning having settled into the clearer, more ordinary light of midday. Dorothy came out and stood beside me. We stood there for a moment without speaking, looking at the street. "My son called," she said finally. "He saw it on the news." "Good," I said. "He's coming next month." She paused. "I don't know if it'll stick, but he's coming. That's something." "Yes," she said. "That's something." I turned to her. "How are you feeling, really?" She considered the question with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "I feel," she started, and then stopped and started again. "I have lived a long time, Mr. Rourke. I have been invisible for a lot of it. Not cruelly invisible, just the natural invisibility of an old woman who doesn't make demands and doesn't cause trouble. You become part of the background. It's not painful exactly. It's just," she searched for the word, "it's diminishing over time." She looked at the empty street. "Today I was not invisible," she said. "Today I was seen by 300 people who had no reason to see me except that it was right." She turned to look at me. "That's not a small thing, Mr. Rourke. That's not a small thing at all." "No," I said, "it isn't." I want to tell you what I carried away from it. I've been a member of the Hells Angels for 44 years now. I've seen the organization at its worst and at its best. I've made choices that I'm ashamed of and choices that I'm proud of. And at 72, I've stopped trying to construct a balance sheet because I don't think life works that way. I don't think the good cancels the bad or the bad cancels the good. They all exist. They all belong to you. What I carried away from that Tuesday morning in October, from the pharmacy and the woman in the blue cardigan and the 300 bikes on Mariposa Street, is something that I think about when the early mornings are hard and the joints ache and the dreams aren't quite nightmares but aren't quite anything else either. I think about the nod, the first one, the resignation nod, the one Dorothy gave when she decided to leave without her medication. The nod that said, I don't matter enough for this to go differently. And the second one, the receipt nod, the one she gave when Travis spoke to her on the porch. The one that said, I understand what this means. I accept it. Thank you. Between those two nods is everything I think matters about being human. The distance between them, between the acceptance of invisibility and the acceptance of being seen, is the distance we have the capacity to create for each other, if we choose to, if we show up. That's what the ride was. 300 men choosing to show up for one woman who had learned not to expect anyone to show up. Not because she had done anything to earn it in the transactional sense. Not because she was special in any dramatic way. She was simply a person living her quiet life, not asking for more than what she needed. Because that's enough. Because that has always been enough. I saw Dorothy several more times after that. She and Peggy became closer. I think the day brought them together in a way that stuck. Roy came for Thanksgiving and Christmas that year, and as far as I know, has maintained a more consistent presence in her life since. Her heart medication has stayed covered through an arrangement that the chapter has maintained now for going on 4 years. She turned 82 last spring. Peggy organized a small party. I sent flowers because I was in Nevada on that particular weekend, visiting my niece. Dorothy called to thank me. She still calls me Mr. Rourke, which I've stopped fighting. And she sounded, as she always sounds, calm and clear and fully present in a way that I find both enviable and instructive. I think about Craig Whitfield sometimes too. Not with the anger I had in the beginning, more with, I don't know, more with a kind of sadness maybe. A man who had a small position and used it in a small way, and never understood the size of what a small meanness can do. I don't know what he became after that day. I hope, in the way you hope for things you have no control over, that he understood something, that the image of those bikes on that street found its way into him somewhere and opened something. Maybe it didn't. People are not always changed by the things that should change them. I know that as well as anyone, but sometimes they are. I know that too. Hank had a heart attack 14 months after the ride on Mariposa Street. He survived it, barely according to the doctors, and I believe them because I sat in that hospital waiting room for 6 hours, and the man who came out of surgery looked like someone had turned him inside out and put him back together with less material than they'd started with. He recovered. He rides less now, and when he does, the doctor has a list of conditions that Hank treats with the selective hearing of a man who is not quite ready to make those concessions, but is making them anyway, one by one, in his own time. I visited him in the hospital on his third day, when he was stable and bored and already complaining about the food. I sat in the chair next to his bed, and he looked at me and said, with a seriousness he didn't often carry, "I keep thinking about Dorothy." "Yeah?" I said. "I keep thinking." He stopped, started again. "I keep thinking about how nobody showed up for her. For how many years nobody showed up, and then we did, and it changed something for her." He paused. "I want to be more like that, more consistent about it." I didn't say anything wise in response to that, because I'm not always the person with the wise response. But I reached over and put my hand on his, the way men of our generation do this kind of thing, awkwardly, briefly, meaning more than the gesture contains, and he nodded. That nod, not resignation, not receipt exactly, something in between, the nod of a man deciding something, quietly, in a hospital bed, watching the morning come in through the window. I'm 72 now. The Road King is still in the garage, still running perfectly, though I ride it less than I used to. The knees are what they are. Carver passed 2 years ago, which I don't talk about much, and Slim followed him 6 months later, and the house is quieter in a way I've adjusted to, but not entirely accepted. I still go to the clubhouse, still sit at the long table with Travis and whoever else is there, still drink the coffee that is always slightly too strong, because nobody in the chapter has ever agreed on the right ratio, and we've stopped trying. Still look at the photographs on the walls, the men who are gone, the men who are aging, the young men who are just beginning to understand what they've joined. I still think about that Tuesday morning in October. I think about the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell and the clear, worn face of a woman going through her wallet a third time, looking for something that wasn't there. I think about what it cost to walk to that counter. Nothing really, $25, and the minor inconvenience of a conversation I didn't want to have. I think about how close I came to not doing it, how close any of us come, any given moment, to not doing the thing that's right there in front of us, the thing that costs so little and means so much. I think about 300 bikes on a quiet street, engines going quiet all at once, the sound of that silence. I think about the nod. Here's what I know at 72 that I did not know at 28 or 40 or even 60. The measure of a man is not his past. It's not the sum of his choices, the weight of his reputation, the length of his record, the distance between him and the life that polite society considers respectable. The measure of a man is the moment in front of him and what he does with it. I had a moment in a pharmacy on Oak Street on a Tuesday in October. I did something with it. The rest followed. That's the whole story. That's all it ever is. Guys, I want to end this video by saying something from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being here with me. I mean it. Every view, every like, every comment, all of this means so much more than you can imagine. I know your time is precious, and the fact that you choose to spend a few minutes here watching what I create motivates me to keep giving my best every day. If this video touched you in any way, let me know here in the comments. I read everything, and often it's your words that give me the strength and inspiration for the next video. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community that's growing with so much love. And if you can, share this video with someone who also needs to hear this message. I am immensely grateful for each and every one of you. See you in the next video.